everybody, this is Fun Police, and I once again am bringing you another deck tech for cards. About a week or two ago, we had the June balance patch that brought about a handful of changes, mostly nerfs and some reworks to various cards, and overall mainly hitting the more meta decks. There were, however, a few buffs within there, and one of those was actually to the D4Y SUISEI, which is that Japanese 3-cost bomber. Because of that, I've wanted to get more involved with the Japan air list, which was something that people speculated on previously when the Italian aircraft were buffed, as those filled an important gap of cheap aircraft for Japan. However, that list still didn't really work out. With the change to the D4Y, however, I wanted to try it again, and I think that the list is getting closer to a more complete shell. Now, let me say up front that I don't think you should craft this deck. I don't think this is a deck that is like a meta breaker. I think this is a fun deck to just kind of mess around with in unranked or, just to have fun. I don't think you should invest in it unless you have the cards already and just want to play around with it. With that said, this is my take on a Japan-Italian air deck. It is an aggressive list, looking to often play cheap units, buff them up, and then close the game out relatively quickly. One of the biggest changes was obviously to the D4Y SUISEI, which I think now has become a much more legitimate 3-credit play. Being able to pin potentially several units and still develop a small bomber onto the board is a lot more effective, and I think gives an important sort of synergy that helps the deck a lot, and that is when combined with the Type 94 TK, which is essentially used because it's a cheap body that then gives a surprise attack. Meaning that when we combine the SUISEI and the Type 94, we get access to much more removal within the deck, which I think is important because this deck is not the most outright explosive deck in the meta, so we need to have some removal to get through guards or blow up big threats or do various other things. But regardless, let's jump into the list. So starting out with Admiral Yamamoto. This is a very basic card, but one that is very effective. I would say that the best way to think of this card is that it's essentially something like the British card Finest Hour, which is a 2-credit card that essentially gives a unit blitz and +2/+2. It is arguably a little weaker, but it can hit multiple units, which has various synergies within our deck. But you can even just play this late game on like some decently high attack aircraft and then blitz it in for a ton of damage. So it's a good finisher if you're looking to have a bunch of burst damage. I think it's overall definitely worth a slot within this deck by giving us room to close. Then we have a Type 94 TK. The Type 94, as I talked about, is mainly here because it is a synergy with the D4Y and gives us the ability to not only pin a lot of various units if we want to do that, but also because the surprise attacks can be turned into removal if we pin a unit and then use a surprise attack. We also have a Burst of Fire. Now, we only have one copy of Burst of Fire, and I find that this deck does not have the best draw engine, and I think that's probably the biggest thing holding this deck back, is that it doesn't have real options for draw. So we're only running one Burst of Fire, but Burst of Fire gives us some potent additional damage by being able to turn any fighter we want into essentially double damage by giving it Fury for that turn. It can especially be combined with Admiral in order to create a Blitz Fury fighter on almost anything that has +2 attack. That's probably going to deal out at least like 10 damage to the enemy HQ. So this can be a potent finishing combo, and both of these are essentially here to help us set up kills. Then we have Air Superiority. This is a very efficient 1 credit removal option. It's a good high tempo tool and probably one of the best air support cards for Japan overall. 1 credit to deal 3 damage to a unit is just very efficient, and it overall is just able to wipe out most early game units like swordfishes, greyhounds, red devils, on and on and on. It's very, very efficient. We have the first Italian card, the FIAT C.R.42. This is a big buff this was a big buff to British Air and made Italy a significant air ally. But being able to play a 1 credit 2/2 plane with 0 operation cost on turn 1 is quite powerful. Now you do need to have the board advantage to get this, but if you put down the Fiat and it's the only unit on the board, it'll get its effect, meaning you get a 2/2 plane for 1 credit. Very good on turn 1. It applies pressure immediately and overall just works very nicely. On top of that, that 0 operation cost works very well with something like the Admiral, who is able to give these planes blitz and then they operate for free, potentially giving a lot of damage for almost no cost. Then we have Roll the Skies. Roll the Skies is something people have mocked a lot online because of how bad it was, but it got buffed to 2 credits, and with the addition of more significant air tools to Japan, Roll the Skies is a legitimate card now. It's not a overwhelmingly like win the game card, but if you get ahead and can play Roll the Skies and get it to trigger once or twice, it can very quickly pay off not only itself, but also just snowball the board. I've had games where I've had just 1 or 2 fighters out, and those fighters are turning from like a 2/2 or a 2/4 into like a 3/5 and then a 4/6, and it snowballs, and the enemy is hard-pressed to deal with it, while I'm also developing additional bombers that also then get buffed. It can very quickly get out of hand, and the enemy can only really stop it by preventing you from hitting their HQ, which they can't always do because we have a fair amount of bombers or a couple ways to go to hit the enemy HQ without needing to attack into it. Then we also have Desperate Measures. Vanilla, pretty much a standard card in every Japan deck ever. Highly efficient, deals a ton of damage for its cost. Losing the credit slot is a minor downside when you're able to wipe the board for 2 credits. Overall, just really good. There's not a whole lot to say about it. Then we have Edge of the Empire. This was a card that I was personally quite excited for within Japan because it was potentially going to give more aggressive decks a new way to build themselves. And people tried it, and it overall didn't really work out. Feigned Retreat was overall superior. However, I still think Edge is a solid card overall. And as such, I ended up putting it in here because I just really needed a card draw order. And I think Edge of the Empire can do that decently well. The biggest benefit of Edge of the Empire is that we're always seeing 3 new cards, which potentially helps us draw into additional threats or dig for something like our combo finisher pieces. There is some anti-synergy within the deck because if we have something like Burst of Fire in hand and we're looking for a fighter, Edge of the Empire is going to shuffle away the Burst of Fire, which is a bit of a pain. But I think that with just 2 copies in the deck, it's enough to where if we're running out of cards, we're able to play this and draw, and get a new hand of 3 to 4 cards in order to just kind of hopefully find enough gas to close a game out. If I didn't have this, I probably would not play this deck, however, because in terms of draw, there's just simply not a lot here. The only other options that I might consider would be stuff like the Type 96 AA gun or the 61st Infantry Regiment. But in all honesty, these are just really slow for our deck. You could also consider Feigned Retreat, and I thought about it, but we have too many orders in the deck to make it consistent. And you could even potentially try to run Empire of the Sun, but that is expensive, and this deck does not really drag the game out that long on average. Usually by turn 10, we're looking to kill the enemy and not, draw a new hand. I think there could maybe be, you could tweak the deck to fit more into a slower list, and Empire becomes a more legitimate tool, but overall, I've opted for the aggressive list, and as such, I think Edge is one of the better ways to work with it. Moving on, we have the F1M2 PETE. So PETE is a really good elite actually for this deck. Being unable to be attacked by ground units means that for the most part the PETE is essentially immune to unit attacks. Only enemy fighters or bombers can really kill it. However, not every deck has options to those, so the PETE comes down quickly and essentially has to be removed through orders. And if it doesn't, it will stick around for probably a long time where it will be able to steadily gain value. It's an excellent target for stuff like Rule the Skies, as once it starts getting buffed up, it becomes a nightmare to deal with. The only downside is a high operation cost, but generally that's fine because you're getting a sticky bomber to have on the board. Then we have the Ki-43-IIb. This was a card that kind of serves dual purpose. The first thing is obviously that it is a 2-credit fighter, which is something that this deck is always kind of hungry for because we don't have a lot of other cheap options. But the other thing is that we get a random Japanese unit upon its destruction. Now, the list of 1-credit units is quite varied, ranging from potentially really good stuff like 33rd Recon to okay stuff like the 15th Cavalry Regiment, or we get something like the Himeji Regiment, which is pretty bad. However, I think overall, you generally will benefit from just being able to put additional units on the board, because at the very least they're able to contest the enemy and at least fight back a little bit. And it helps to kind of act as a pseudo card draw, which is something that, as I talked about previously, we're always kind of looking for. Then we have the C.202, which got buffed also alongside the Fiat, and now doesn't outright die when it is when you have less HP than the enemy. And because of this, you generally can stick this on the board quite consistently, and it operates for very cheap and is very well statted. It's just overall a really good 2-drop, and it's hard for the enemy to remove it. It generally will trade down at least a couple units and is overall decently effective. Then we have the Ki-43-IIb OTSU, and this is a decent little fighter for 3 credits. Because we're generally trying to dominate the air, we can generally have this be a 5-3 fighter for 3 credits, which is quite a decent chunk of damage. It's going to hit quite hard. The only thing that I've opted for is that I'm not running all 4 copies, because generally I think there are better things that we can be running in the 3-credit slot, but having a couple hard-hitting 3-drops means that we can snowball a potential early game blowout. Like, for example, if we play a Fiat and then on the next turn do something like air superiority, we're able to follow it up with the Otsu and then from there we can hopefully kind of deal a ton of damage and close the game out. It also pairs extremely well with something like the Admiral, who is able to give it Blitz, meaning that you can deal a total of 6 damage from hand, which essentially turns it into like one of a big Blitz plane, which is quite good. In fact, the Otsu is one of the best to combine with Burst of Fire and Admiral, because this makes it 7 attack, and it has Blitz and Fury, meaning that's 14 damage from hand if you can combo it with it. Very, very hard hitting. We also run 2nd Raiding Brigade. The biggest reason is that 2nd Raiding is a very efficient removal on a unit. It's able to blow up a slow attack enemy unit, which is always nice, and then you get a cheap Blitz infantry that can clog up their front line or trade into something and finish it off. It's just generally a very solid Japanese card. And then we have the C6N SAIUN. This is a card that is similar to the PETE in that it cannot be attacked by ground units, and that's the main thing we're using it for. It's essentially a 3-3 fighter that is able to be protected from ground units, meaning it's hard for the enemy to often remove this. This makes it great for buffs, and also it activates Rule of the Skies if it sticks around, so that is a very efficient card in terms of just what it does. It also blocks countermeasures, which is not the most common thing, but it's a nice little bonus to just have. Then we get to the D4Y. So this was reworked with the latest balance patch in order to be much more proactive, because it now has a deployment effect that is able to pin multiple enemy units. I've had the ability to pin an enemy backline before and completely flip the game in my favor due to the D4Y, and it's especially devastating if you can chain these together. Bogging down an entire line of units for multiple turns is very efficient. It also combines with the Type 94, which is able to give it surprise attack, which we can then use to blow the enemy up with. But the D4Y is just like a proactive 3-drop, which is something that the deck has not actually had up until this point. Then we have the Ki-43 DINAH III. The Ki-46 is one of the few things that draws us cards. It draws us our 1-drops, which is actually a benefit because the Fiats are very cheap, and having a bunch of them in hand can set up like a big Admiral play. Or we can draw in the Type 94s, so we can more consistently combo it with the D4Y in order to remove enemy threats. It's overall just a very nice card, and is, again, a really solid staple in the majority of Japan decks. Then we also have Lion for a Day. When I initially ran this list, I opted more heavily for just a lot of cheap fighters and whatnot, but I quickly found out that this deck does absolutely need some removal, and Lion for a Day serves as a good removal to get through big guards, deal with buffed up units, and also just blow up like some big bomber or whatever that might be pushing us off the board. This is a pretty standard removal order. Italy has used it in Control, and even though it was nerfed to 4 credits eventually, it's still a decent enough card, and I think works well here in giving us a key card that can help us punch through guards. Then we also have Bombing Raid. This is just like a staple in every Japanese deck. 4 credits, you deal 3 damage to something. It can hit face for burn damage, or it can act like a pseudo AoE. It's just overall very efficient. Then we have the Calm Before the Storm. This is one of the bigger payoffs for developing our cheap air units. By being able to potentially operate with them and then give them +3/+1, we hit very, very hard and turns even a modest looking board into something kind of disgusting. Stuff like the C.202 turns into a 5/5 fighter, and that is extremely hard to remove. It also makes stuff like the Pete and the C6N into just really hard-hitting units that are difficult to interact with. Even something like the DINAH is turned into a 4/4 fighter that operates for 1. It's overall a big payoff for the deck, and probably one of the best ways to take a small advantage and turn it into a game-winning position. We also have the Ki-83, just an incredibly efficient 4-drop. Even though the enemy is drawing multiple cards, you don't really care because you're having an oversized fighter that is also drawing you an additional card. Generally, you're able to use if he sticks around for several turns, the enemy will lose because they're gonna take so much damage from the Ki-83. And then we finally have the Shiden, and the Shiden is just a pretty staple card again, but is a great finisher for various deck lists. Being able to have that natural Blitz Fury means that if we go to turn 11, the Shiden is 8 damage from hand, and is a very common way to close the game out. It also is a decent threat on its own, because if the enemy tries to trade into it, that ambush makes it difficult to kill with smaller units. So it can potentially stick around, and if it does, you probably win the game outright. And that is the deck list at the moment. I've, however, also been experimenting with other things. One of the biggest things that I've tried out is a more pin-heavy strategy. Using stuff like the Sonya alongside the Tenzan and naval operation, I found that there might be another controlled, maybe like more mid-range version of Japan Air that looks to efficiently blow up everything by constantly pinning it, so you're able to deal with a lot of threats and be reactive, and then you would want to finish the game off through stuff like the Shiden and now the Kika, and then you would also even be able to access stuff like Empire of the Sun for a big draw order. It's something that I've toyed around with, but I felt like this is more developed already and fits more naturally with like the cheap planes we're playing. So I think that although maybe there could be something there, I eventually gave up on it in favor of doing a more aggressive list. With that all said, in general, in the mulligan, you're looking for the Italian planes. The Fiat and the C.202 are just almost always good keeps. After those, desperate measures, air superiority, rule the skies if you have a couple units already can be incredibly powerful. And then after that, I would just keep like a 3-drop if I have one, after I have like a 1 or 2 drop. And the general game plan is play out your planes, be aggressive, buff them up, use your removal to get through pesky units, and win the game through some big blitz plane that finishes the enemy off. With that said, let's just hop into a couple games and show you how it does. Alright, we're against another Japanese deck this time. So going second again, which is a bit of a shame. So we have actually a pretty good hand here. I think the Edge of the Empire can go, but I'm liking the rest of this. We have removal through. We have a turn 1 play with the Fiat, air superiority, and the Type 94 the turn 2. And then later in the game, hopefully we can develop another unit or 2 and have a calm before the storm. So he's actually playing seemingly some sort of... This could be Japan aggro, would be my thought process. So I actually am going to develop my Type 94. Okay, it very much is an aggro deck. He's going to surprise attack. He really wants to get that damage and win the board. But I'm going to prevent that, because I'm going to develop the Fiat and immediately kill off that Type 93. Seemingly this very much seems like an aggro deck, but seems like he has not drawn particularly well. Because he's seemingly just drawn a lot of his low impact 1-drops, meaning that he's very low on cards. Now granted, he could be running something like Enigma, or still have Feigned in hand, and that's why he kept this. But he's not applying a lot of pressure right now. So if we're able to leverage a little bit of an advantage here... Alright. So now he's getting aggressive. Oh, I actually misplayed there. My bad. I forgot about this, the 202. Oopsie. I should have had the Fiat trade into it so I had a 1-1 plane left. That was a mistake on my end. Alrighty, well, it seems like the enemy had maybe a bit of a weak hand, but we were able to have decent interaction. Alrighty, up against a Soviet deck. So, Soviets have a decent amount of varied things they can be doing. They could be value, they could be artillery, even maybe tokens. Ooh, happy I got a Fiat turn 1. That's like pretty much the best thing we can do. If we can get a 2-drop here, we're going to be in smooth sailing on curve. Sadly, no 2-drop, but we'll develop the Type 94 anyway to get that surprise attack saved in hand. So that is probably Soviet value. I feel like I probably have to desperate measures here because otherwise he's going to trade this all into my board. And I actually don't really want him to do that, especially seeing as I've drawn a Calm Before the Storm. And I know that I throw my curve off, but being able to next turn like develop the Ki-43 and then the turn after that do Calm Before the Storm, it could be enough to close the game out. So he takes that over. I think that was a very efficient use of his credits. I guess he feels like he's just under a lot of pressure, which I guess he is. So he's taking control of that. Has he got a sickle then? No sickle? This is strange. But I guess we'll just deal 5 damage. And I think I'm actually just going to Edge of the Empire here. I don't have enough units to make Calm Before the Storm work. So I think it's better just to look for, like, something to, like, give us blitz damage and hopefully close this game out. Well, there's Rule the Skies. If he can't answer this, then he's gonna die. Well, he's not dead, but he's going to be on 1 life. Meaning that any, like, bomber... If we can find, like, Admiral plus a bomber, that'll close the game out. Or just literally anything we can give blitz to. I'm very surprised he did not have a sickle there. I guess he just drew a weaker hand. No sickle in the early game. Seemingly really threw him off his game. He had a lot of probably high-cost cards in his hand. Alrighty. So we're going up against the US deck, so this is probably either frontline or ramp. We definitely want to probably assume that it's going to be the more aggressive one, so we're going to keep the Fiat, which is an auto keep, and because of the Fiat, we're going to keep air superiority. So it is frontline, which sadly means that our Fiat is going to only be a 1-2 instead of a 2-2, which is a bit of a shame. But we'll be able to cleanly answer the Red Devils with air superiority. Okay. So he still was playing United We Stand, so we have 3 credits to develop the Otsu, and if this remains, then I'm going to probably air superiority and then punch face for 5 damage. Alright. So I could pin this, but at that point I'm not really going to be able to... I feel like probably just getting the 5 damage done would be the best option. And then we just simply remove this. Because then he's probably going to have to spend most of his turn attacking the Sherman into the Ki-43. Which he does do. So Edge of the Empire generally encourages more aggressive plays. So depending on... Let's see, would he want to... I could just pin this and develop the Fiat. It might be worth it just to kill the Sherman and pin this and deny him the ability to draw any cards that turn, unless he plays like a Blitz unit. Because this sets up a Desperate Measures, and I can use like the other D4Y to pin anything he plays. Depending on what he does, we might Desperate Measures. So he's going to weak hand do it. But I think we're just going to keep pinning. Now, I think the question is, do I probably do still do this. Or I could develop the rating, but if I do this, then this better sets me up to Desperate Measures next turn. If we could find Rule the Skies, that would be fantastic. So this is definitely an excellent turn to Desperate Measures. And we'll kill off the California. And then I want to do this. And I don't want to develop anything else into the board because of the risk of strategic bombing or the occasional Stars and Stripes. I want to be able to react to most of that. He's in a tough position if he does not have access to some sort of removal option. He's got some big buffs going on. This is an excellent turn to play out raiding, though. Bit of an awkward turn. Do I keep applying pressure to his face, or do I try to soften up the legions? I probably have to soften the legions up. If he's running legions, he could be running uprising, so I feel like it might be a better idea to just trade out the Fiat now. This also means that he has the double intel if he wants to keep this alive for a turn. That is a tar now. Alright, so he's going quite buff heavy. That's the second edge of the Empire. So at this point, I think it's time to just shuffle. We'll remove away his big unit. We do have now a surprise attack in hand. Alright, so he is going with the Legion play. Definitely a lot of legions out. I will probably want to remove those. I definitely think the bombing raid is going to go right here, because that kills very cleanly a lot of his board. There's the Stars and Stripes. That actually really hurts now. The fact we didn't find a lion... If we had a lion for a day last turn, or if we had found lion for a day, I think we would have been fine here. We would have been able to deal with his board of legions, but I think now it's kind of starting to get out of hand on our end. This is a very guard-heavy deck and has a lot of big threats. If we had found like a Calm Before the Storm or something like that, we probably could have closed this game out, but sadly we didn't. As you're kind of seeing, the card draw of this deck is pretty unimpressive, which makes it hard for us to really match up. Yeah, this is probably a lost game. We just don't have the card draw to keep up with it. That's not bad, but it's not going to win us a match either. As you see, if he didn't have so many guards, we actually could have killed him there. We would have had the damage to do it. Sadly, it's just not going our way this match. It's a lot of removal. We were in a good position until the Tarnow came down and we lacked a response to it, which we try to offset, but sadly doesn't always happen. Again, as you see, the card draw is probably the biggest thing holding this deck back, so hopefully we're a little bit luckier in a further match. And that is going to be it for today. So as you saw, those games were actually pretty close in terms of us winning or losing. And some of it was maybe a little bit lucky on our side. However, that's why I said at the start of this video that this deck is not the most meta thing. I think it's a fun deck to try around, but I think there are still some gaps that exist within the deck that need filling, most notably the draw. Keep an eye out for if Japan ever gets like draw orders or draw cards that are not like as slow as their normal options. If they get some faster draw tools that aren't like expansion that relies on the frontline control, I could see Japan Air becoming a more realistic thing. Or maybe keep an eye out if we have an ally that can draw cards and provide cheap air units. Britain does kind of do that, but I found Britain to be a little less impressive than Italy in terms of that early game power, so maybe it's better overall and there's just a build out there. I think there's a lot of room to try stuff out in, so if you try out any other decks, share them down in the comments below. I'm always interested to see what people end up doing with those decks. If you like this content, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm going to continue doing cards content, as always, and bringing you new deck techs and update videos and various other things. Otherwise, that's all I got for you today. I thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.